What's up, it's Alex here. I know it's been a while since my last video, so I'm happy to finally be back. So make sure to subscribe and hit like button and leave comments below. Today I'm gonna talking about how to make your Swift code look more like Swift code. I've created an article on Medium a while ago called When you write code in Swift, write code in Swift, and that's basically a video on the same topic. What I want to talk here today is that Swift has many unique and not that unique instructions and some different methods, approaches that other languages don't have. If you come to an iOS development from another language, either it's Objective-C or anything else, Java and Python, you just might not know everything about Swift, and this video will help you kinda improve your skills and write your code in a more Swiftish way. So let's start. So first of all, we'll know for loop syntax. So if you have an array of some elements like strings, foo, bar, hello, world, you know how can you go through this array. So you can just simply create an array with a range of array.count, and that's not really smart approach. And here like array I. So in this case you will print all the elements in this array and it will be fine, but it's not the best approach. So basically I'm sure anyone knows that we can just use an element in array and that will basically be the same. Yeah, but what if your array contains of different stuff? For instance, you have an integer, boolean, some other double value. In this case, your array is of any type. So here you can add something like string, or even just reuse the element word and check like this. In this case, yeah, probably need to add this explicitly. So in this case, you will print all these elements, all the string elements from here, and that will work for you, as you can see here. But there is a simpler approach for in case you're working with the Swift. In this case, you just can use for case let element as string in array. In this case, all the occurrences that can be casted to string will be in this closure, in this block. So we should get the same output here because there are only 4 strings. So as you can see, it's an easy thing, and that looks really great. Another thing is, for instance, if you do need to use an I, for instance, you need to know the position of the element instead of having this thing here, as I showed before, with showing like element I or something. There will be error, but who cares? Instead of doing so, you can use enumerated. So basically, you create a tuple of index and element, and you add enumerated modifier that basically converts it into a pair of index and the element itself within this structure. So basically now you can simply print that, for instance, element is, for instance, you want to use, just print element here. In this case, you'll have both index and the element here, so it's simple. So in some cases you may use the older approaches with the just I or with some other elements, but just remember that there are different ways to do that. So imagine you want to find an element in an array. So for instance, you want to find an element that is actually our maybe this bar element. In this case we can just usually go, I mean not can, but we may do this. We can use a filter and check if this equals bar, and then we'll have an array, filtered array of these elements, and we can take the first element here. In this case we'll just print this element and here, and that should return us this particular element. Yeah, okay, let's just make it simpler for now, and I'll get rid of all the elements, so this array will be an array of strings for the simplicity here. So you see, we have a bar, but the thing is that we are iterating through the whole array, and that is not cool. So to make it simpler, since we don't need to have a filtered array, we can simply do some easier thing using first where with the closure, where we tell that we need bar. So as the previous approach went through this array 4 times, meaning the complexity was linear, this one will be still linear in worst case, but it may be a little bit faster, because when it finds the first occurrence in the array, it prints this element. So the result is the same, but the approach is a bit different. And in terms of syntax, it's more clear that you don't need a filtered array, that you just need first element that conforms to this condition. So the same goes with everything else. So instead of let me copy this, I'll just return this back. So instead of checking if, for instance, if the array has at least one element, we don't need to care about which. If we just need to make sure if this array contains at least one element here, we just print, yeah, bar exists, and yeah, that will still work, but again it will go through the whole array and iterate through all the elements there, and yeah, it returns that. And we can make it simpler. We can just add contains closure, and we just check if the array contains any elements within this thing, and yeah, of course it will, it will be executed, and again it performed faster because our bar is here. If it's the last element, it will be the worst case scenario that will take the very same time, and well, it's not a big deal when you have some small array with not like thousands of elements. It's still a good approach to just use wherever makes more sense. So because your code needs to be as understandable as possible. So basically it should be a well-written document that any person can understand in the perfect world. So you should try to be as close to this definition as possible. Yeah, so let's move next. Next, how do we check if array isn't empty? We shouldn't just simply check if it's 0, saying that array is empty. Array is empty. Else, I'll just copy this stuff here and we'll put it here. So obviously our array won't be empty. Yeah, but we don't need to count elements in this array, so the simplest approach would be to use isEmpty variable. So if you run it, it will execute the same, but it makes more sense because you are actually checking whether it's empty or not. Yeah, and by the way, speaking of arrays, I forgot to mention one thing, that there is another method for arrays, is forEach. So it's a good thing to, I don't know, just do the same as print 0, for instance. It's basically the same as creating this structure here and printing this element here, so you can even just set this element here and write it here, so it's almost the same, but in many cases it looks clearer and you may just go with that. Just keep in mind that you cannot use words such as continue in this array, because if you break it, you just interrupt the whole for each cycle. So if you don't have some complicated logic, you can just use this thing. Also, if you have a function, for instance, I don't know, perform some action that takes an element that is string and, for instance, print this element, you can just simply, for instance, make it even simpler and call this function that should be above, because we should do this, and that will still work. I'm not sure if we can do this, but maybe we can. And yeah, we should be able to do even this. So yeah, as you can see, you can even do something like this. So in this case, you see that this is so clear, and it's way clearer than this thing. You just want to perform some action for each element within your array. Isn't that super straightforward? Let's go to the next stuff. So for instance, if you have a filtered array, you may want to let's create just a simple structure that will have, for instance, and something like isActive, that is bool, and I don't know, a title. No, even this is fine. So we'll have another array, we'll call it foo's, that will have foo. Oh yeah, we need to move it up. Is active true, and maybe is active false, and active true again. So yeah, basically we have an array of 3 elements, and for instance we want to get array, like let's create maybe UID here, and we want to get all these elements that are active. So you may just use this filter, use this closure block, is active, yeah, not if but let. Yeah, in this case you can do this one, or you can have like UIDs that will be whose map 0 is UIDs. Yeah, but that's not the super perfect approach, so you can just use keypaths here. So basically you can use a keypath to isActive, or for instance in this case you can use UIDs. So it is basically the same, but it looks a little bit better, and just you remember that you can just use a chain of different things such as isActive, map. In this case you'll have all UIDs for all active elements. So basically in your case you'll have these 2 elements mapped into just an array of UIDs. Okay, so let's move forward. I noticed that many people don't use this guard word in Swift. That is really cool. So if you use some function, do something, and you have like condition 1, for instance, that is boolean, and condition 2, that is boolean, for instance, you can create this weird chain of conditions. They will perform some action here, else we can check, for instance, something else. Here we can also check if condition 2 is true, then do something 1.1.1 or 1.2. Yeah. So in this case, we can even replace it with some simple thing. For instance, if this is always an error and this one is error, then we just can check if these both conditions are true. So one of things to do here is to use them, just enumerate them with commas, and yeah, in this case you'll have your condition here, and this is still not the perfect thing. So the best thing would be here is to check if these both conditions are true with the guard statement. So here we'll just throw an error and return, and after that we'll just perform our block of code here. So it's really great. If you don't care about errors, you can even make this one line, and in this case you'll have some stuff here, do some work. It looks better than ifs inside of other ifs, so remember about that. Another thing that's worth mentioning is defer block. So whenever you have some function, I don't know, load something, maybe that has a completion block, you can just add a defer block that will maybe mark some outer value, like is loading, that is false. We can set it to false again. We can call a completion block, and we can just call is loading true, and we just remind ourselves that yeah, we should set it to false here. And here we just call like do some work here. So once this block of code here is done, you'll get this one. So for instance, if you have a guard for something like is loading is false, else return, and after that we set is loading to true, and by doing so we check that we don't load this already, and in this case we just go with this, do some work, and we finish our task. In this case, this defer block will be called either inside of this block or after this one. So whenever you get to return, this block will get executed. So yeah, that's a good thing to put some code inside to make sure that you won't forget anything. Okay, let's move a bit faster. In many things, in many classes, you may have some manager that will have static functions shared, and it will be a manager, it will return some instance of this manager. Don't do that. Instead of that, you can just return a calculated variable shared. For instance, it is still calculated, we just return, I don't know, some maybe shared value, and maybe here will be shared as well, and or something like, I don't know, maybe private var shared, that is manager, and something like this. Or maybe if you have some method like func, formatted string that will return a string, instead of doing so, just use a variable formatted string. So in this case, when you call this, for instance, if it's an extension of your date, yeah, you can just call date formatted string, and this way looks way better than having these two things. And use these use functions only when you want to show explicitly that when you call this method you perform some operation. Otherwise, you don't need to know these implementation details, and you just need to receive formatted string here. Another suggestion is not to use the word self when not necessary. Do it only when it's inevitable, because why do you add it and make your code less readable? For instance, you have like an index or maybe some name that will be string. In this case, you may want to create an init method, and in this case, yes, you do need to explicitly set this as a self.index and self.name. But if you want to perform some, I don't know, for instance, increment function, in this case, don't use self.index and just simply use index and increment it by 1. It looks more readable, so you don't need to add this self word. Add it only when it's necessary or adds clarity to your code. Another thing here is when you have some method, for instance, update with a name that is string. For instance, you need to check if this name isn't empty. You can use a guard, but don't set it as a strong name, else return. For instance, like this. In this case, you want to assign your name, this name, because yeah, you need to use self here because there are two different variables. Don't do this. No, actually, yeah. Don't do this. Just use name. It's totally fine. You can overload any variable, not any variable, but in this case, you can overload this variable and use it like this. It makes it simpler. So if you have some closure that you are calling, like here, some closure that is escaping, you can just want to wikify self to avoid reference cycle. In this case, don't use strong self or something like this. Just simply use self equals self, else return. In this case, you can do whatever you want, like index or something, I don't know, whatever you want. So in this case, it looks better. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. And yeah, I have another topics to cover here. And I think we'll continue in the second part on this. So for now, feel free to let me know what you didn't know, what you did know, and maybe some other suggestions, what you do in Swift that it doesn't look like in other languages, and what makes your code clearer and more understandable. The second part will arrive hopefully soon, so we'll talk about protocols, some other stuff. And for now, feel free to subscribe, hit like button, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video.